Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar. It's Pennsylvania Workers' Compensation, How Businesses Are Classified. That's presented by the Pennsylvania Compensation Ratings Bureau, better known as PCRB. I'm Suzanne Stoltenberg, the Communications Director for the National Federation of Independent Business, NFIB, the Pennsylvania chapter. Now throughout the webinar, please feel free to type in your questions and hit enter. If we can raise them, we will. Otherwise, I will get answers for you from our presenter after the fact and email you the answers. Now I would like to thank our sponsors, if I may. They are Capital Blue Cross, Members First Federal Credit Union, and the law firm McNees, Wallace & Nurick. Our presenter today is Robert Ferrante, who's a Senior Classification Analyst, Technical Services with the PCRB. He's been there 25 years, and his area of expertise is grouping business types or classes when it comes to setting rates. Now, I want to make clear there's also a rate component related to a business's claims history. If he can't answer a specific question about that, although he probably will be able to answer most of them, we will follow up with you after the webinar. Now listen, Robert, thank you so much for doing this. Greatly appreciate it, and I'm going to throw it to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Good morning, everyone. As Suzanne said, my name is Robert Ferrante. I'm a Senior Classification Analyst with the PCRB. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about what the PCRB does with a particular focus on the classification of employers for workers' compensation insurance. So to jump right in, what is the PCRB? The Pennsylvania Compensation Rating Bureau, PCRB, is a nonprofit corporation formed in 1915 in accordance with the insurance laws of Pennsylvania. Our enabling statutes specify that classifications of employers, underwriting rules, policy forms, loss cost values, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and rating plans for workers' compensation insurance are to be proposed by an independent rating bureau situated within the state. The PCRB is not a government agency. That's something we're questioned about a lot. Are we state employees or a government agency? And we are not. Again, we're an independent nonprofit corporation. Having said that, we are subject to supervision and examination by the Pennsylvania Insurance Commissioner. What that means in a practical sense is that when the PCRB proposes loss cost rating values or revisions to the classification or other pricing plans, we have to file those proposals with the Insurance Commissioner for the Commissioner's review and approval. Our membership is comprised of all insurance carriers, including the State Workers Insurance Fund, that are authorized to sell workers' compensation insurance in Pennsylvania. If an insurance carrier sells workers' compensation in Pennsylvania, they're required to be a member of our bureau and follow our classification and other pricing plans. One thing we do not do, which is something we're questioned about frequently, is conduct hearings in contested cases involving workers' compensation claims, nor are we involved in the enforcement of requirements for employers to secure workers' compensation benefits, or for that matter, securing insurance for their business. Those are functions that are under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Workers' Compensation, a separate organization from the PCRB, and a division of the Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry. Their functions are geared more towards compliance with the Workers' Compensation Act in Pennsylvania.
So this is more what your entity does, which is not a government entity, is basically evaluate the risk and set basic rates. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah. Our functions deal mostly with how workers' compensation insurance is priced in Pennsylvania. We administer the classification plan, which plays a role in what an employer pays for workers' compensation insurance, and we also develop the base rating values, which we'll get into in a little bit.
Okay.
PCRB website is PCRBE.com, and I'm going to get out of here so I can show you the website. So this is the PCRB website. Again, the address is PCRB.com. As you can see from the home page, we are also the Delaware Compensation Rating Bureau. So we perform these functions for both Pennsylvania and Delaware. So we can click on the Pennsylvania banner, and that'll bring us to the home page of the Pennsylvania site. And there is, as I said, a wealth of information that I think employers will find useful. You can access rating values here, which gives you access to the PCRB loss costs. There are circulars which you can access, which are basically advisories that we send out to our member carriers and can pertain to a host of issues, classification-related matters, rate filings, that sort of thing, and those are available for anyone to access. Filings, you can also take a look at if we file for revised rating values or proposals to revise the classification system. You can take a look at those. And there's a host of other information here too, and a section devoted to classifications, again, which we'll get into in a little bit there. So going back to the presentation, what are classifications? And that's pretty much what we're here about today. Classifications are a way of grouping similar businesses and identifying workers' compensation loss experience attributable to those similar businesses. As you can see from the slide, there's about, this is a rough estimate, but there are about 350 classifications. That number does fluctuate from time to time, but that's roughly where we stand with the classifications.
So, for example, at the riskier end, you'd have maybe roofers or, you know, something like that, and maybe on the other end, you would have some kind of office workers. Is that basically the gist, and they would each have appropriate risk ratings?
Yes, that's a reasonable explanation. In the example that you gave, what we do is we collect loss and payroll data for the businesses under each classification, and that's used to analyze the risk associated with each business, and that's where the rating value comes from through actuarial means. So something like a roofer, which is assigned to code 659, you will see on the higher end of the scale, as opposed to something like an accounting firm, which is classified to code 962, which would ostensibly have a lower exposure to risk. So that's essentially correct. Classifications are needed to ensure that the cost of the workers' compensation system is fairly distributed among employers throughout the state. Without classifications, employers would be required to pay a single average rate regardless of their true potential for loss. So going back to Suzanne's example, if there were no classifications, you would average in employers at the higher end, such as a roofing firm, to employers at the lower end, an accounting firm, and there will be one single rate based on all of the employers insured in Pennsylvania. So when you have classifications, you can more narrowly define risk associated with a particular type of business. The loss experience developed by a group set of employers is analyzed to produce a PCRB loss cost. A loss cost is a dollar amount per unit of exposure, and that unit of exposure is per $100 of payroll, which is needed to pay for losses developed by the employers within a certain classification. So again, what we do is we collect loss and payroll data, which is submitted to us by workers' compensation insurers. And using that data, we develop the loss cost for each classification. Excuse me. We propose loss costs to the insurance commissioner for the commissioner's review and approval. Carriers can then adopt the PCRB loss costs or file for their own loss costs for selected classifications or all classifications. In my experience, most insurance carriers will adopt the loss costs that we file for and gain approval for.
Does that mean that the price when you're shopping around, it's all the same and don't even trouble shopping for insurance?
The loss cost represents sort of a base rating value. So ultimately, that won't be what an employer is charged. In Pennsylvania, the rates for workers' compensation insurance are competitive. So the loss cost represents only one component of the carrier's rating value. What happens to that loss cost is then the carrier applies to that what's called a multiplier. And that multiplier contemplates the insurance carrier's expense margins, profit margins, and other considerations. So those two numbers are applied together, and that is how the final carrier rate is developed. Now, those rates will vary depending on who the insurance carrier is, so it is a competitive system. And we can illustrate that by taking another look at the website. So as you can see, there on the menu of our homepage, there's an orange box at the top left-hand corner that says Application Login. the user can click on that, and in order to use this function of the website, the user will need to establish a username and password. There's no fee involved. It just asks for some basic information. So I'm going to log in using my password. So in this section, there is a link that reads Carrier Pricing Benchmark. And if you click on that, and there's some brief introductory language, which I will just accept, this allows you to search by carrier name or by class description carrier rating values for each classification. So you can look at any carrier's rate for any classification. What we can do in this case to illustrate the competitive nature of the rating system is pull up a specific classification, and I'm going to use one that we're going to discuss later in the presentation. As you can see, there's a host of classifications. We're going to talk about code 454, which is the sheet metal products fabrication classification. By entering that classification and just hitting search, what this provides is each carrier's rate for that classification. And you can sort it by carrier name. It'll go alphabetically. If you know which carrier you're interested in, you can search by their name. Or you can sort it by the rating value, going from low to high or high to low. So as you can see, this illustrates that depending on an employer's selection of workers' compensation insurer, and that insurer is willing to write the employer's workers' compensation coverage, the rating value and ultimately the premium that the employer will pay can differ. And again, these rating values show that depending on the insurance carrier, their class rates will differ.
Oh, so it really can differ quite a bit.
It sure can. You can see here there's a relatively high rating value. That's probably the highest for this classification. And if you look at the lowest, there's a pretty substantial difference. So this does work as a useful tool for employers who do want to shop around their workers' compensation insurance.
Now, didn't you tell me off the webinar that some insurers may not accept you, so some of the low rates you see may not be something you can just call up and get. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. This information is here for informational purposes only. We cannot guarantee that an individual insurer will agree to write an employer's workers' compensation insurance coverage. That is up to their own underwriting guidelines and other considerations. So again, this information is here for informational purposes only. The one exception to that is the State Workers Insurance Fund, which acts as a carrier of last resort. If an employer cannot, or for whatever reason chooses not to get coverage through one of the commercial carriers, then the state fund will write that insurance.
And I did see you were on that on page 10 at the highest rate.
Yes. What is the objective of the classification system? The objective is to assign each employer to the one classification which best describes the employer's field of business. It is the business that is classified, not the individual employments, occupations, or operations within the business. Most classifications attempt to bring together a similar group of employers engaged in the same general type of business or reasonably similar businesses. Within certain limits, the PCRB attempts to establish classifications on an industry-wide basis. This objective is consistent with the purpose of workers' compensation insurance, which is to ensure the liability of the employer for injuries suffered by the employer's staff in the course of their work. One thing to keep in mind is that the employer is the insured rather than the employer's individual operations or employees. All classifications contemplate a variety of operations and employments which present a range of greater and lesser hazards. In view of that, the loss cost for each given classification reflects the loss potential of the entire operation of the business described by that classification. And our next slide is going to show an example of that. Code 454 is titled Sheet Metal Products Fabrication, NOC. So that's the formal title of the class. NOC means not otherwise classified. As with most field of business classifications, it includes a number of businesses which we consider to be similar. One of the businesses assigned to this classification is employers engaged in duct fabrication. So given that the class applies to the field of business, for an employer making or fabricating duct, this class applies to not only the fabrication area, but employees engaged in painting and finishing work, employees packaging the finished products, warehouse and delivery staff, R&D or research and development staff that are engaged in either improving the employer's own products or developing new products for the employers. It also includes maintenance staff. This would be employees who maintain the employer's equipment, vehicles, or premises. And security, and this would be simply people or staff that are providing security for the employer's premises. So again, to emphasize, we're classifying the business of duct fabrication, and that includes all the various employments or occupations within the business.
I'm noticing that you don't have just the office administrative people on there.
That's correct, which brings us to our next slide. There are special classification assignment concepts which deviate from the general principle of classifying by field of business. The first one is the standard exception classifications. Standard exception classifications depart from the overall philosophy of classifying by field of business. In Pennsylvania, the standard exception classifications are codes 951, which is for outside salespersons, and code 953, which is for office persons.
I'm sorry, for office workers?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So outside sales and office employees are generally subject to separate classification because these employees are found in almost all types of businesses and are not normally an integral part of the employer's operational hazards. So because they're similar, regardless as to the type of business an employer may operate, we separately classify them. They can be separately classified for most businesses that are in the manufacturing, construction, mining, and public utilities businesses.
Now, I'm getting a question here. This gentleman would like to know, and this is very true with small businesses generally, if you have an employee who's mostly in the administrative field but may spend maybe 5% of his time in another area that is germane to the main function of the business, how would that change anything?
Generally speaking, it would not. I would provide one caveat. We can always review any situation if there are unique circumstances or any other reasons why we should take a look at it. But generally, I would say no. The reason being is that would constitute an interchange of labor. If an employee interchanges, say, for example, in the case of our sheet metal shop, if they're performing office work, but for whatever reason they may have exposure to the shop for whatever reason, their entire payroll would be assigned to the basic field of business class of code 454. The definitions for the standard exception classifications are pretty specific in that they apply only to employees who are exclusively engaged in the work that's described by either classification. And as an adjunct to that, I think that's why the rating values for those classifications are generally much lower than the field of business classifications because they are so specific. Again,
so you can't have them, be 5% one type of employee and 95% another type. If they are only in the office, that's the classification. But if they do multiple duties, that cannot be?
That's correct. The general procedure, and there are some exceptions to this that we'll get into, but the general procedure is that you cannot divide an individual employee's payroll among multiple classifications.
Okay.
So a second consideration under special classification assignment concepts are all-inclusive classifications. Certain specified classifications require the inclusion of outside sales and clerical office payroll, and these are generally designated all employees including office. So any classification that's so designated would not permit the use of code 951 and 953. The reason for that is because these types of employers, or I should say the types of employees utilized by these businesses, the typical physical configuration of the employer's facilities, and the ways in which the work of the business is structured and conducted, the distinction between activities which are and are not integral parts of the employer's operational hazards is more difficult to establish. An example of that would be for an accounting firm. The accounting classification is code 962, and that includes all employees. And the rationale behind that is there may not be much distinction in terms of process and hazard for employees that are doing the books for the business and the employees that are doing the actual accounting work for customers or what have you. So in that situation, we include all employees under the basic field of business classification.
That makes sense. Okay.
And one thing to consider is that when developing the loss cost for an all-inclusive classification, it does include the experience of the outside sales and office employees in the actuarial development of the loss costs. So that exposure is considered when we develop the rating values for an all-inclusive class. Some classifications are designated all employees except office, and in those cases, the outside sales staff is included within the basic field of business classification, but you can separately classify office staff. An example of that, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say it's a little confusing. I'm just curious, do the brokers or insurance people, providers, they understand this, and if someone has a specific question, they can inquire with them?
They should, and it's been my experience in dealing with agents and brokers, and particularly carriers, that they are familiar with the class system and that they will know when a classification is all-inclusive or when it includes all employees except office. Our information is very transparent, so you can go on our website. In addition to getting the rating values, you can get information on each classification. So this brings us back to our home page, and you can see on the menu of links, there's a link for manuals. When you click on that, you'll see these three links. You'll want the Pennsylvania Basic Manual, and this is just some brief introductory language. And this chart will let the user, whomever that may be, open or download a number of versions of the manual. And as you can see, it goes all the way back to 2002. The most recent edition is dated 4/1 of this year. And when you click on that, that will open the manual. So this manual includes all of our rules and procedures, and there's a lot to it.
So just say, for example, you want to know who's under a certain category where it's all-inclusive or just secretarial and administrative. Do you have a search function here?
We do.
So 454 is what exactly?
That's the sheet metal shock classification. So just keeping it uniform with the examples we're giving. So that does allow you to search, and here's an example of what a class entry in the manual looks like. You'll have the title of the classification, some brief explanatory language, and what's called an underwriting guide, which is a listing of all the types of businesses that are included under the basic classification. In illustrating what we were just talking about, all-inclusive classifications, the example we were using was code 962 for accounting firms. And you can see it's designated all employees, including clerical office.
I see. So you can go into your particular classification and learn all the details about it, who can be included, who isn't, what types of sheet metal businesses there may be included in that.
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So going back to our presentation. Further consideration, classification assignment concept are multiple enterprises. In some instances, additional classifications other than the standard exception classifications may be authorized for an insured employer which operates two or more distinct and physically separated business enterprises using separate staffs and having limited or no operational continuity between enterprises. So we can assign multiple field of business classifications to an employer if that employer operates separate and distinct business enterprises. Again, that would involve separate businesses that aren't related to each other in terms of operational continuity, that are conducted by separate staff and separate work areas. An example that we had is if you have an employer that operates a manufacturing plant where they make electric motors, and at a separate location, the same employer has a manufacturing plant that manufactures plastic bottles. Those are two completely different types of businesses. If those businesses are separately located and separately staffed, then we can classify each one of those businesses based on the merits of that particular business. So that does happen. I do see it quite a bit. And a final example of a special classification assignment concept is for the construction industry. It's our view that there is generally a lower degree of homogeneity between construction businesses than there is between manufacturing, utilities, mercantile, and professional service businesses. Typically, construction workers are hired for a particular job. Their employment often ends when the hiring contractor is part of that job or the job itself is finished. Construction businesses have no fixed workplace and may be subject to a broader range of hazards than other types of employers and businesses. For those reasons, construction classifications in Pennsylvania are structured either by trade, such as electrical wiring, plumbing, painting, paper hanging, etc., or on a project basis, which indicates all work to completion, such as water main construction. We found that a lot of contractors operate entirely within a single trade so that their classification assignment would be limited to the applicable trade classification. However, multiple construction classifications can be approved for a single employer. If the employer performs multiple trades and there are trade-specific classifications for those trades, then we will assign them for the employer.
Even if they use the same employees, there is a way to do that even though the employees aren't different, as you were stating before.
That's correct. For the construction trade, is an exception to the general procedure where you cannot divide an individual employee's payroll among multiple classifications. For construction work, if you have employees who interchange between construction trades, you can use multiple construction classifications for such employees, provided that the employer maintains separate payroll records for the different types of work performed. If the employer does not do that, then the entire payroll of any interchanging employees must be assigned to the highest rated classification representing any part of their work. Now, if a construction employee also does clerical work, you can't divide their payroll with the clerical classification. This applies only to payroll division among construction classifications. Is the PCRB's classification system ever changed, and if so, why? It is. Classifications may be added, deleted, or amended in order to recognize economic or technological changes in a particular industry. Such actions or reviews as to whether or not such actions are appropriate may be initiated at the request of an employer trade association, an insurance carrier, or may be generated internally by the PCRB staff. One thing that we do often point out when we get requests from employers or agents or carriers, can such a certain business have a separate classification, is that it's not possible or desirable to devise a separate classification for each individual employer or exact type of business, since many businesses do not have a sufficient volume of experience to be a reliable indicator of future experience. So when developing new classifications, one of the things that we do look at is that there's a sufficient volume of loss and payroll data to make future indications of risk to hazard reliable. How are classification system changes accomplished? We don't necessarily want to have a separate classification for each individual employer or type of business if they don't have a sufficient volume of experience. And basically what that means is if the payroll and loss experience in a particular industry is low or not sufficient to warrant a separate classification, that could play havoc with the rating values for that class. So we want to identify a certain volume of experience in order to determine if a certain type of industry should be separately classified. We also want to be able to identify that the experience for that industry is different from the other industries with which it's currently classified, and if the operations are appreciably different. If so, then we'll review that industry to determine if it should be separately classified or assigned to a new and separate classification.
Could you possibly give an example of that so people on the line or listening would get a feel for whether that might be an option in their field?
Yes. Basically, if perhaps a recent example might be a way to go with it. We recently reviewed a classification for machine shops and precision machining. And what we looked at is businesses that are performing precision machining, which deals with performing machining work that meets certain machining tolerances. And we were finding that we didn't have the expertise to identify the tolerance criteria that were established for assignment to the classification, nor did we find that the experience between employers doing precision machining versus rough machining was appreciably different. So we reviewed some files and we decided that we were going to eliminate the criteria we had established for the precision machining classification. So any employer that's performing contract machining work would be assigned to the precision machining classification. So we retitled it and we restructured the criteria for assignment to the classification. For the listeners, I think what they would want to keep in mind is if there are a number of similarly situated employers to them, meaning a number of employers that are in the same industry that forms a subset of one of our classifications, if they think there's sufficient volume in that, or a number of employers in that subset, and if they think their operations are significantly different from the remaining operations that are assigned to the same classification, then they can petition us to address that. Now, every time we get a question, we may or may not initiate a full study, but certainly if there is thought among a specific trade or a group of employees, or employers I should say, that their business doesn't belong in the class that they're currently assigned to, they can certainly pursue that with us.
I do have a question. I'll ask it briefly. If it's not appropriate now, we can answer this person back. Is the PCRB's classification system the same as, based on, or totally different from the NAICS code, NAICS?
It's not based on it. We don't use it as a guide, and there's no sort of relationship between the two. Now, you may find coincidentally that there might be some overlap with the way that they group classifications together or types of businesses together, but there's other than that, it's not based on that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So if we were to go the route where we're going to study a particular industry to determine if the classification should be changed, what we do, and this is unique to our state, as I understand it, or our states, there may be a handful of others that do this, but it's not common countrywide, is that we will review the operations and loss experience of the employer group under review. And what that means is we will look at our file for each employer, which we have files for every employer that has workers' compensation in the state. We'll look at those files, and if we have recent information telling us what their business operations are, we'll consider that in the course of the review. If we do not, then we'll develop that information, and that may take the form of sending the employer a questionnaire or having one of our field reps come out and survey the employer's business. Once we gather all that information, we'll analyze the loss and payroll data of the employer group that's under study, and we'll compare that with the remainder of the class they're currently assigned to. And we'll use that comparison as a basis to determine whether or not they should remain in that classification, be assigned to a newly created classification, or if they should be reassigned to another existing classification. So there's a lot of work and a lot of careful analysis that goes into expanding or changing the classification system.
And at some point you're going to show us on the website how someone can make an inquiry or an appeal or whatever you call it.
Yeah, what an employer can do on the website is that is less with respect to a class study as it is to that employer's individual classification. We'll talk about how an individual employer who just feels they're assigned to the wrong classification can petition us to review that. So we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Okay.
In fact, we'll talk about it right now. So yes, an employer can obtain a classification review from the PCRB. Again, if the employer, and this is separate from a class study where, again, we're looking at whether or not new classification should be created for a certain type of industry. What we're talking about now is if an employer is assigned to a classification and based on their business operations, they feel that no, there's another classification that's appropriate to what I do, they can petition us to review it. And to start that process, we need one of the interested parties to submit an inquiry to the PCRB. The interested parties could be either the employer themselves, their agent or broker of record, or their carrier of record. And again, any of those interested parties can start the process. We can accept a letter to do that, but probably the best and most efficient way to do that is to use the form on our website. Can an employer contest the PCRB's classification decision? The answer to that is yes. Basically, as I said, once we perform the classification review, we will send out a classification notice letter that will go to the interested parties explaining the classification assignment. It will either approve a request that's made to us or sustain the current classification assignment, or it could deny what the individual is asking. If the employer disagrees with that, they do have an option to appeal that decision. They can write back into us with an explanation as to why they disagree with the class assignment. What we do ask for for something like that is that they explain why they disagree. We understand that employers' bottom line concern is the rates that they're being charged, but what we ask in an appeal letter is that they describe why they disagree with the assignment other than the rating consideration, and that could be either our information regarding what their business is not accurate, or if perhaps it is accurate, they disagree with how we interpreted the classification system. So they can write into us, and generally what will happen, that'll come back to the analyst that initially reviewed the file. They'll consult with senior management, and we'll determine if the class plan was applied properly, and if so, we'll send out what we generally refer to as a final decision letter that says we've considered your request, we either agree with what you're saying or our original decision was correct, and again, we'll notify the interested parties of that, and that'll again be our final decision. If the employer remains aggrieved by that, they do have the option of presenting an appeal before an appeal subcommittee of the PCRB, and that's comprised of equal parts members from carrier members as well as from public groups. They could be from trade associations or what have you. So there's an equal membership of carrier representatives and public members. They'll get to come in, present their case to the subcommittee, which will then convene and decide whether or not we applied the class plan correctly or if the decision that we made should be overturned. Once that happens, then we'll send out our decision resulting from that appeal process. If the employer remains aggrieved at that point, they have a further option, which is to go directly to the insurance commissioner. This, what your folks are seeing now is a copy of the appeals procedure which basically explains the process that I just touched on now. We tend to send that out with any decision letter that we anticipate an employer may disagree with. Most of the times that happens is if we're reclassifying an employer to a classification that carries a higher rating value than the class that they're presently assigned to, or if an employer requests a different classification and we disapprove that request. So we'll include this so the employer knows what they would need to do if they want to appeal that decision. And that concludes the formal presentation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and we shall be in touch afterward about people's questions. Everyone, take care.
Great.
All right, bye-bye.